Philosophical perspectives on the sense in which moral claims can be true or false can be defined by two basic metaethical dichotomies. First, when we conceptualize the idea of value or goodness or beauty, we conceptualize it as either dependent or independent of the mind. If we contend that it is independent of the mind, then we are claiming that values refer to objective features of the world, that they are real things rather than mere beliefs or conventions. If we posit that values are created by the mind, on the other hand, and are determined by attitude and opinion, then we are claiming that values are ultimately unreal. Insofar as moral claims can be true or false, they are at least subjective. The second dichotomy refers to the applicability of value and is, therefore, more significantly involved with moral action. This dichotomy describes whether or not value judgments apply independently of time and circumstance, whether they are absolute or relative. A value is considered absolute if it applies universally throughout any context, that it ought never be violated. Conversely, a value judgment is considered relative if it has truth relative only to certain social or subjective conditions. It may be valid to one person but invalid to another. These are thus the four basic properties of the notion of value, the combination of which result in four basic cognitivist classes of axiological orientation. The distinction between subjectivist and objectivist interpretations of virtue and beauty is expressed by the distinction between the objective absolute and the subjective relative, but we are again interested in that class which seeks to unite the subjective and objective perspectives, the subjective absolute. A subjective absolute value would be a value that exists dependently on the mind, as an attitude or opinion, but which also applies universally and absolutely across cultures, times, and circumstances. Due to the complementarity or perhaps contradiction between these properties, we would not expect it to be possible to develop a method of prescribing moral action in regard to this view. If we allow that value is dependent on minds, then moral judgments are justified whenever the subject considers them to be so. However, insofar as individuals are bound to disagree on the moral worth of actions, we are led to conclude that two subjects may be equally justified in conflicting beliefs, thus entailing relativism. If we want values to be absolute, they cannot then be grounded in human opinions whenever those opinions are variant. Only if it were the case that everyone always agreed on moral judgments could normative, subjective absolutism obtain, in which case we would need only to investigate what we all agree on to determine moral truth. However, some moral philosophers have considered a form of moral subjectivism whereby the subject involved is not the producer of a judgment, but a hypothetical observer that is fully informed of all relevant facts, is immune to any kind of bias, and has an infallible capacity for reason. According to this idea, it matters not that people disagree on what characterizes virtue or beauty because people are fallible. There may indeed be an absolutely correct judgment or action for any given circumstance, but this can only be ascertained by an ideal mind. Nevertheless, if value judgments are those that would be approved of by an ideal observer, and if the ideal observer is simply they who make valid judgments, then there is no way to learn what moral claims are true, and there is no way to build a normative theory of subjective absolute value. So, how can we learn what is good and just? Our ability to arrive at proper value judgments may not be found in the perception of objective features of the world, but may be present inherently in our own psychic structure and our own capacity as moral agents. This line of thinking has a rich history and is central to any claim of the reliability of moral sense and reason. It is found, for instance, in the various formulations of the Golden Rule, and later in Kant's categorical imperative, which dictates, "Act only in accordance to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." In other words, if everyone could always undertake a certain action without such universal undertaking eventually making the action impossible to undertake, then that action may be considered moral. Now, Kant is often presented as a moral realist or objectivist, but many Kant scholars recognise that this is a mistake arising from the conflation of his universalism with realism. For Kant, all of the moral characteristics of the world are dependent upon the human mind, and his categorical imperative is that method by which we determine which maxims qualify for the status of moral law. Moral philosopher John Rawle explains, "The categorical imperative procedure is laid out on the basis of the conception of free and equal persons as reasonable and rational. Thus, practical activity by agents who view themselves with a resulting collective self-conception provides the basis for a procedure that in turn provides the content for morality." On this view, Kant is seen as a moral anti-realist because morality is not independent of the practice and self-conception of certain types of beings. The possibility of acquiring moral knowledge through reason alone implies that there is a logical connection between ethical behaviour and moral truth. To boot, Kant believed that we are held to the categorical imperative precisely because its denial would be illogical. That is, if a universal law would prevent its own adherence when taken to a logical extreme, then that law must be false. It is precisely in the absolute consistency of maxims that they may be validated by the categorical imperative. For instance, if everyone stole from others when it benefited them, then everything would be stolen, and nothing would be left to steal. It is therefore illogical that stealing could be moral. This makes morality a matter of reason, and so just as a logical truth is rational everywhere and always, an ethical action is moral everywhere and always. The difference between logical truth and ethical action, of course, is that ethical action is necessarily practical. It is concrete, and it is evaluated only insofar as it is perceived a posteriori. Indeed, the subjective absolute, and its reliance on one's conception of oneself as a moral agent, expresses a coming together of principles and praxis, the subject and the object, and therefore also the analytic and a posteriori, which is in turn a coming together of logic and experience. Kant scholar Stephen Palmquist explains, "The law is analytic in relation to other laws in its system because it can be used to test the validity of such subordinate laws, yet it cannot itself be verified by appealing to a higher law. The difference is that whereas logical laws are necessary a priori for all thinking and are thereby equally applicable in principle to all experience, practical laws apply to what ought to be the case, a posteriori, in matters of conduct, and allow for conditions under which what should happen often does not. Thus, for example, we call someone good by judging the extent to which their behaviour, considered a posteriori, coincides analytically with the idea of perfect goodness. That is, the extent to which their behaviour is, as it were, contained in that idea of perfection." Ethical action is just rational action, for goodness is a part of understanding. Once more we find that the subject and the object, here expressed by absolutism and subjectivism respectively, are complementary when our reason is self-referential. Just as the self is both subject and object to itself, goodness and virtue participate in themselves. The idea of perfection was indeed Plato's concrete universal, which he referred to as the form of the good. A form is the pure ideal of a quality, and so the form of the good is the perfection of perfection. Self-reference abounds in Plato's moral philosophy. It can be found, for instance, in his assertion that justice is of the nature of the just, and nothing can be pious if piety is not pious. Indeed, it is in the connection between perfection and self-consciousness, goodness and knowledge that we may find the ground of our moral reason. Both of these notions are the concrete universal, and both are subject to their own function. Subjective absolutism posits that morality is rational, but only is it rational to a perfectly rational, perfectly self-aware mind. Such an ideal observer is simply they who knows virtue and beauty, and virtue and beauty are simply the opinions of such an ideal observer. The definitions of each rely on the other, for perfection and self-consciousness are each other. So, what is goodness, and virtue, and beauty? The answer is that it is us, and so we needn't ask, we simply know, we just don't always know that we know. And the reason for this is because we do not fully know ourselves, we are not completely self-aware. If only we knew who we are fully, we would be good fully.